brown bag, so there's no need or expectations for you to come, but if you want to go grab something down the street, or we got 3 restaurants here at the Parkade, and then come back to our TEI space, those who'd like to sit with us. I'm going to carry on a conversation with Mike, and I'll let you in on that, let you also jump in. So for those of you who have a little higher interest or the time and schedule availability to meet with us, we're gonna do that for about maybe an hour, hour and a half. So we'll start right at 1 o'clock. So our workshops will end at 12:30, and then we'll be back in there and ready to roll at 1 o'clock. Sound good? All right, so it's an emos. Woohoo, St. Louis style. Yeah, excellent. A big thank you to the event partners. So those are on the back of your program there. Once again, sure grateful to everybody who helped. So Chris Gadsden with Ground the Lead. Check out his ministry and sign up for his newsletter. I read, I'm going to say every one, and I'm always helped by it. I think you'd really love to get hits, so go to his website there at Ground Belief. And then also Rob Phillips and the Missouri Baptist, particularly the Apologetics Network that he oversees here in Missouri. Really appreciate their participation. And the initial start of this all started with Ed Phillips and Compass Church, who said, hey, I'd like to hear from this. So we love our collaboration where others say to us, we'd like to bring a scholar in, and how could TEI be a part of that? So that's how this was created. And so thanks, Ed. Really, really grateful for that as well. And then our friends at Central Christian College of the Bible as well. We had a great time with them yesterday. Love those students and faculty there. So that's terrific. Also, thank you to our supporters, those who are able to give financially to help make this happen. So both through our partners as well as through your ongoing giving. Many of you who are in the room, or churches that you represent, have been faithful, and we're on track within just a few $1,000s of meeting our annual budget by the end of June. And so, kind of like this 3rd year now, we've been full-time every year. I'm like, this will probably die out this year. It's probably done. I'm a glass half empty kind of guy. And then the Lord's like, no, we're not quite done with you yet, so let's keep rolling. So that couldn't happen without, this is just made available. Everything we do is at no or very low cost. And it's because people go to our website and give, or send a check, or become monthly supporters. So thank you for your attention to that, for those in the room who represent all those good gifts. If you have your phones, I'm going to mention or a piece of paper, I'm going to mention just a few things that are coming up. First of all, if you have any interest, again, my motto is, I don't need you to be here. If it's helpful to you, I create things that I want to be a part of. So first of all, on May 7th, and through even on Monday, just watch your emails. By the way, if you're not on our email list, or you heard about this from somebody else, I know there's a few in the room, you need to go to our website and give us your information, and then we'll send you direct contact about the information that we have coming up for church leaders and campus ministers. As long as you understand that we're not trying to teach people the Bible, teach them theology, we're not trying to do those kinds of things, we're not about leadership development. We are about teaching the people who teach people the Bible. We're about teaching people who teach people theology. And so it's really about equipping ministers, campus leaders, small group leaders, men's ministry leaders, women's ministry leaders, etc., bivocational pastors, minority leaders, their faith communities. That's what we're about. So a few events. First of all, Dr. Sarah Sumner is going to be with us, and I'm asking her to come in and talk about board governance Christianly, how to think Christianly as a nonprofit and church board. And there is a crisis happening throughout the U.S. related to this issue of corporate management instead of Christian management of both churches and nonprofits. So I've asked her to give us some direction and guidance in that. So we'll be doing some things in Monday, Tuesday, and then she'll be with us for a TEI event here on the evening of May 7th. Also just kind of celebrating TEI and recognizing our financial supporters and our institute students. August 1st and 2nd, Gary Lane is coming to us from Atlanta Grace Ministries. They are the theology, biblical mind behind all of the 220 network. What that means is union with Christ perspective, what has historically been known as the Keswick sanctification process, the Bill Bright's perspective, all these, Neil Anderson, Charles Stanley's Exchange Life, all of that, these are the theological, biblical roots who make sense of it. Gary Lane's going to be here with us for a workshop and morning session, and then over the weekend. So that's coming up, and then I already mentioned Jude 3 Project. If you're not familiar with that, make a note of that, Jude 3 Project, check it out. Lisa Fields and the work she's doing, particularly related to apologetics among millennials and particularly African American community as well. And so I'm in email conversation with her, and that date is exactly the weekend before Easter, just like this is. So I believe that's like April the 2nd, so you can get way ahead. Our winter lecture series always follows the weekend after ML King Day on Monday, so we're accommodating our campus ministers in that. So anyway, that weekend as well. So if you like to plan ahead, and I don't know yet who we'll invite to come for that, but we're talking about some various individuals and sending signals out. All right, that'd be good. TEImissouri.org, by the way, TEImissouri.org. If you hadn't checked that out, you can go to the events page. And on that events page are previous lectures that we've done, like Lois de Verberg, the Kirk McGregor on Luis de Molina is there, if you're interested in that. The brown bags that we have done over this past year, which has been a new effort for us, those things are there, so to make them available. Hey, I had a thought this morning as I was getting out of the shower. If you come to an event, you can come for free, but what if I put all those events that we record and then make people pay a charge for getting there? That would encourage them to come, because then you have to pay a charge to get to the event. How much do you think these lectures are worth, Mike? Say $50. A monthly support, right? Okay, well, thanks again for joining us. And I started to use that song that church did, not Mike Licona, but I don't know, I had to, maybe I'll end with that after a while. We've had a good time with you, and everybody give a good morning and a warm welcome.
A few years ago, I was speaking at a church in Virginia Beach, and the pastor had been a professional musician, and they had a really good worship band. So when he thought of the name Mike Licona, the song My Sharona came up. So he just redid the thing. If you want to know about resurrection, that's when you gotta get Mike Licona. So he recorded it and gave it to it, and that's the bumper music for our podcast, the Risen Jesus Podcast. So if you ever want to hear it, you just go to our website, risenjesus.com, and then look at the menu at the top where it says podcast, and then you can bring it up. We've got a couple seasons. All right, nice being with you all. I'm going to open up with a short video I think you'll enjoy.
You say either, and I say either. You say neither, and I say neither. Either, neither, neither. Let's call the whole thing off. You like potato, and I like potato. You like tomato, and I like tomato. Potato, potato, tomato, tomato. Oh, let's call the whole thing off.
Well, gospel contradictions, it's probably the main objection against the historical reliability of the Gospels. And you'll have a lot of them, critics that will say, okay, you got all these gospel differences. And Matthew and Mark say there's one angel at the tomb, and Luke and John say there are two angels at the tomb. And John says one woman went to the tomb, records one woman, whereas the other Gospels have multiple women going to the tomb. And one was Jesus crucified. Was it after the Passover meal, or was it before the Passover meal? And all these different things, and by the time you get through this litany of all these gospel differences, every Christian is saying, say it ain't so. And every skeptic is saying, just call the whole thing off. So what do we do with these gospel differences? How do we approach them? What is a good way to do it? What's the best way to do it? Well, typically over the years, a lot of Christians from early church, even up until present, have tried to harmonize the accounts, as though taking them, if you remember the old transparencies and the overhead projector, it's like you lay the transparencies on top of one another, and they all just come out to the same picture, just different ways of looking at it. This harmonization. But sometimes you have to go too far with those. So in the 1970s, I think it was 1971, the president of Fuller Theological Seminary at that time, named Harold Lindsell, wrote a book, The Battle for the Bible. And so he was trying to look at the one of the discrepancies in the Gospels, and that is Jesus' prediction that Peter's going to deny him 3 times before the rooster crows, right? And so you read that in all 4 Gospels, and in 3 of the Gospels it says, you will deny me, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. But in Mark it says, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And so it has Peter denying Jesus, the rooster crows, and then after he denies him the 3rd time. And Lindsell said, well, the way we reconcile this is, and he borrowed this from another guy who earlier had proposed it, I forgot what his name was. He said that Peter denied Jesus 3 times and then the rooster crowed. And then he denied Jesus 3 more times and the rooster crowed again. In all, he denied Jesus 6 times, something that would go against what the Gospels actually say. So you can see these kind of tortured. It's like, the way I put it is, that it's like the harmonizers will subject the Gospels to hermeneutical waterboarding until they tell them what they want to hear. And this is to do violence to the Gospel text. It is not to respect the texts as God has given them to us. So it just seemed to me that there was a better way. And it's usually done in this way because a person does have what they regard as a high view of the Bible. And they say, well, the Bible's got to be inerrant because it's God's divinely inspired word. And so therefore we have to be able to harmonize all of these. I can appreciate that. But when you have to resort to that kind of violence to the text in order to get it, I think we're on the wrong track. And so a principle I tell my students throughout the semester, and say it over and over and over again, is this. Our view of Scripture should be consistent with what we observe in Scripture. So what do we observe in Scripture? That's what we want to look at. And as I really gave this a lot of thought, I've spent 8 years looking at this. And the majority of, well, I'll just go with this. I came up with an answer that's just, it's groundbreaking. It solves, it gives us a view, a different approach to these gospel differences that I think makes a whole lot more sense. And on top of it, it sheds more light on the Gospels in other areas. And I'll share that with you. It's not a profound way of approaching the Gospels. In fact, it is so simple that I'm going to tell you right now, you're going to come up with it before we go further in this, and I reveal it to you in this lecture. All right? So, 2 questions for you. If you were going in the 1st century, or let's say any time, if you're going to write a book about an individual and their life, what kind of genre are you going to use? Horror fiction, poetry, or biography? Biography. Okay. I heard that the Arkansas Razorbacks, they would say A, you know. But all right, so C, biography. All right, pretty simple. Here's the second question. It's really difficult. If you are a biographer who lived in the 1st century, and you're writing to readers who live in the 1st century, and you're writing about a figure who had lived in the 1st century, when you write that biography, are you going to use the rules for writing biography that were there in the 1st century or in the 21st century? How many think the 1st century? All right, great. So when we read the Gospels, we read them as biographies written by biographers who are using the rules for writing biography that were in play in the first century. All right, it's kind of just common sense, right? But we find that it's pretty uncommon when we approach the Gospels. So the question is, what were the rules for writing biography and history at that time? Now that takes a lot of grunt work, and I spent 8 years doing that, and it resulted in the book that I see some of you have, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? It was published 2.5 years ago, and I think I said to you last night, if you are not used to reading some heavier apologetics books or academic work, you probably don't want to read this book. I'm writing an easier version of it right now. I hope to have it done by the end of the year. It'll probably be up by November of next year. But this goes to, if you really like this topic and you want to get in depth with it, then this is a book for you. So let's talk, I want to look at truth-telling in ancient biography. Because truth-telling in ancient biography is a little different than truth-telling today. And the best way I know, the simplest way I know how to relate it is this. How many of you are married? Okay. Well, you know exactly what I mean when I say there's the guy version of the story and there's the girl version. Now, I know I'm going to give a stereotype here. There are many exceptions of which I know of, okay? But typically speaking, girls like details, lots of details. They want to know what happened, where it happened, when it happened, how it happened, who was there, what they were wearing, what they were saying, what they were thinking, and how they were feeling. And then they want to know, now that they've told you the story, how do you feel about it? Now, us guys are different. We like bullet points. Get to the bottom line, right? You're that kind of guy, I can tell. Get to the bottom line, the game is coming on in 5 minutes. We don't care about insignificant details, and many occasions, we won't think twice about altering those insignificant details in order to make our points a little more clearly, or in order to abbreviate a story so we don't have to get into a whole lot of details that person isn't going to be interested in. It's not that we're trying to corrupt the truth. We are trying to communicate the essential message that person wants to hear. So there have been times when I've been on the phone talking to someone and I'm telling that person about an event that happened, and my wife's in the background saying, "You know it didn't happen that way." It happened pretty much that way, but if I tell that person exactly what happened, then I have to spend another 5 to 10 minutes giving background knowledge that person isn't in the least bit interested in hearing, and I don't want to take the 5 to 10 minutes to give that time, so I alter the detail a little bit to bring the point out, okay? So I'm not saying the guy version of the story is better than the girl version. I'm not saying that the girl version is better than the guy version. I'm saying that there's different ways of truth-telling, the way guys tell it and girls tell it. So that works that way a lot in ancient history-telling, truth-telling and ancient biography. And a lot of times the way that they would tell the truth would be through, and give the guy version, would be to use compositional devices. Many of them of which we use today, it is just natural that we use them. You won't even think that you use them, and then all of a sudden, now, as I start to talk about them and mention a few, you say, "Oh yeah, I do that without even thinking about it." Okay? I want to look at two different sources, ancient sources, to see where these compositional devices are actually described. And the first are what are called compositional textbooks. Now, most people in antiquity did not receive an education. Only about 10% could read, maybe 5% or even less could read and write. So, but those who did learn how to write in their secondary and tertiary education, which would be in their mid-teens, they would be given these textbooks, compositional textbooks that would have exercises in them. Those exercises were called progymnasmata, or preliminary exercises. And typically what the instructor would do is that instructor would give a paragraph out of a well-known book, like maybe Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and would take a paragraph, and then the instructor would say, I want you to paraphrase this paragraph using various techniques. I'll show you what those techniques are. And so they would write, and on these tablets, in these exercises, they would paraphrase using these different techniques. So let's look at some of these techniques. One would be you would change the syntax or the grammatical structure. Now, there were many ways to do this in Greek. Greek is very precise language, and many ways to do it in Greek, far less to do it in English, but let me just give you, we'll carry an English illustration throughout this. So if you want to change the syntax, we're going to go with this statement and show and keep it consistent throughout. So today I heard Mike lecture. Now if I wanted to change the syntax, I could say, I heard Mike lecture today. Okay? So you just paraphrased it in this sense by changing the syntax. Here's another way to change it. By adding, you would add to the thought. You'd want that addition to contain truth, but it's not going to be a direct quote. You're adding more to it. So instead of saying, today I heard Mike lecture, you would say, today I heard Mike lecture on gospel differences. It's a correct statement, it's a true statement, but it's not in a precise sense insofar as you're not repeating, today I heard Mike lecture. You're paraphrasing it by addition. You could also paraphrase it via subtraction. So instead of saying, today I heard Mike lecture, you abbreviate it by just saying, I heard Mike lecture. It doesn't communicate the entire thought, but most of it does. You could paraphrase via substitution. So you would use a synonym. Today I heard Mike lecture would be changed to today I listened to Mike lecture. So think about when you're quoting someone. All right, today we like to put these quotation marks around and you quote the exact words, but that's not how they did it in antiquity. First of all, there were no quotation marks in Greek. All right, but then they did not want you, it was improper. It was improper to quote a person verbatim. You were supposed to paraphrase. So these were different ways that you would do it. You could change a statement to a question. So instead of saying, today I heard Mike lecture, you change it to a question that says, did you know that I heard Mike lecture today? Or you could do what's called inflection. Now, that's not where you change the inflection like, today I heard Mike lecture. Today I heard Mike lecture. Today I heard Mike lecture. No, that's not that one. Changing inflection would mean to change a singular noun to a plural noun, or vice versa in antiquity. That's what inflection was. So instead of saying, today I heard Mike give a lecture, you would say, today I heard Mike give several lectures. Or you would change the plural to a singular. Or you could create a dialogue, because dialogues are far more interesting, right? So instead of saying, today I heard Mike lecture, you would say, what did you do today? I heard Mike lecture. How was it? Great. I learned some of the reasons why the Gospels often differ from one another. And that would be a correct reporting in antiquity. It would be considered a good way to do it. Good writers were expected to use these and other techniques. These are just a few examples. It's not limited to what I'm giving you here. So let me give you some more examples. And actually we can see these in the biblical literature and also in Greco-Roman literature of the time. So you could alter the order in the story. So when we come to the temptations in the wilderness, Matthew tells us that Jesus was hungry after fasting for 40 days, and Satan came to him and said, since you are hungry, you're the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. You know, and then takes him to the temple, the highest point of the temple, and says, you know, since you're the Son of God, just throw yourself off and you'll be okay because the scripture says that God will give his angels charge concerning you. And then he takes him to a point where he can see all the kingdoms of the world and says, I will give these all to you if you will just bow down and worship me. When we read the same story in Luke's gospel, we find that Luke has inverted the second and third temptations, the order. Either that or Matthew inverted them. So we see this inversion of order. We also see something else going on. We see inflection. Because Matthew has Satan say, turn these stones into bread. And bread, whether it's in English, singular and Greek, we still use the word bread. I'm sorry, singular and plural, we still use the word bread. But in Greek, it's a different word. Different ending of the word. So in Matthew, Satan says, turn these stones into loaves of bread. Whereas in Luke, it's turned this stone into a loaf of bread. So there's inflection going on. Now, before it, you see this thing with the compositional textbooks and the devices of paraphrasing. You might look at that and say, well, that's a contradiction. Is it one loaf or were there many? In what order was it? And then you look at this now with the paraphrasing, and you see that this is the kind of way that good writers were prescribed to write. And you say, well, that's not a contradiction, it's a compositional device. That's not stretching things. I mean, this is the way they were told to write. And the gospel authors are doing what they were instructed to do for good writing. We can go to the parable of the sower. And Jesus talks about, in this parable, he says, okay, you have the seed that is being sown. And some seed was sown on the road, and birds came and ate it. And other seed was sown on rocky ground, and it took its root quickly, and it grew up and quickly, but then the sun scorched it and it died. And other seed fell on thorny ground and grew up with the thorns, and the thorns choked it. And finally, you had some seed grow on good ground, and it grew up and it yielded fruit. Matthew says fruit. Mark says fruit that was 30-fold, 60-fold, even 100-fold. When we read the same parable given by Matthew, it's all the same until you come to the end, and it says, and it fell on a good ground, and it yielded fruit, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30-fold. What's going on here? That's right, inversion. Changing the order. And then you have Luke, and he says that some fell on good ground, and it yielded fruit 100-fold. What's going on with Luke? The guy version, yeah. Subtraction. So we see this stuff going on in the Gospels. You could alter the person addressed. So, for example, at Jesus' baptism, you have he comes out of the water, and the voice, God's voice from heaven says, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." Well, that's what we read in Mark and Luke. But when we read the story in Matthew, the voice says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The difference being, in Mark and Luke, God is addressing Jesus directly, whereas in Matthew, he's addressing the crowd. What's probably happening here is Matthew has changed who God is addressing. He's saying he's addressing the readers so that he makes it more personable to the reader of what's going on here. God is endorsing his Son, Jesus, and he wants the reader to know this. There's another time. Another time you've got, this is early in Jesus' ministry, and the disciples and Jesus are together, and Jesus knew that the disciples were arguing, and he asked them, "What were you guys arguing about?" And they were arguing about who's the greatest. Which one of them's the greatest? But they were really embarrassed now, and they kept silent. They didn't answer him. And so that's when Jesus tells them, if you want to be great, you got to be the servant of all. When we read the same story in Luke, however, Matthew, it's later on, you've got the disciples come to Jesus, and they say, which one of us is the greatest? Now, which one do you think is the way it actually happened? Probably the way Mark had it, right? Because you wouldn't come up to Jesus and say, hey, which one of us is the greatest? But what is Matthew doing here? He's simplifying. Rather than just telling all the details of the story, he simplifies. He's getting the gist, giving us the gist of what happened. He's given us an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. The disciples are wondering who's the greatest, and Jesus is answering them. He's not so much concerned about the precise details. He wants to make sure the principles, all the teachings, all this is communicated accurately. So we looked at compositional devices in the compositional textbooks. These are laid out specifically. Here's what you do to write good history. And it's not comprehensive. And we find these in these compositional textbooks by people in the first century. There's a guy named Theon. He wrote in Greek. We have a Latin rhetorician from the end of the first century named Quintilian. He wrote about these exercises. And they speak of them as though, not that they're coming up with them, they've been around for a long time. It just so happens that Theon and Quintilian are the first to the books that we have that mention them. And then in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries, we've got others like Athonius and Hermogenes and others who give the same kind of exercises. Well, then we come to Plutarch. And Plutarch was born around the year 40, just within a few years of Jesus' death. And he lived, we don't know exactly when he died, but it was probably by the year 125 that he died. Now, sometime in the late 90s, up through just up at past 120, he wrote a lot of works. All right, he wrote what's called the Moralia, where he talks philosophical treatment of various issues, but he's best known for what's called the Lives, the parallel lives. And he wrote over 60 biographies of ancient figures, and at least 10 of them have perished, and we have 50 that have survived. Much of what we know about the ancient world comes from Plutarch. And Plutarch, as I mentioned last night, is regarded as the greatest of all ancient biographers. So when we read Plutarch's lives, what's really interesting, I started to read through them, I don't know, 10 or so years ago. I got through the 50, and as I completed them, I realized that of those 59 of them involved people who lived at the same time, they knew one another, and they participated in many of the same events. So therefore, Plutarch is going to tell the same story after relying on the same sources. So how does he tell these stories? Does he copy and paste? What does he do? And so I went through them a second time, now just those 9, and I put down all the stories as they appeared, and then I went and saw that many of them appear 2 or more times. Some of them as many as 7 in 7 of the 9 different biographies. And then I went through a third time just to read through all of them just to make sure I got all the details down, and it was really interesting. He's a good writer. He's a very entertaining writer. He's easy to read. Suetonius can be very boring. He's writing around the same time. But Plutarch is a very good writer. He makes it interesting to read. So here's what I thought. Well, I'm going to go to these stories now, and I found 36 stories that appear in 2 or more of those biographies. So just to give you an example, the assassination of Julius Caesar. It's reported in Plutarch's biography of Caesar, his biography of Cicero, his biography of Brutus, and his biography of Antony. So now I can compare how Plutarch tells the same story using the same sources and see what kind of differences are involved. 30 of the 36 contain differences, multiple differences. And then when as I was going through these with a fine-tooth comb and looking at all the differences, I'm finding not only is he doing all the things that he would have been taught to do in the compositional textbooks, he's doing a few more things that we can infer, because not only do we see these in the differences, you could have initially looked at them and say, well, maybe he just messed it up. He was sloppy, and that's why the difference. But then when you see the same kind of difference appearing over and over, you say, there's a pattern here. This was intentional that he was doing. This was a compositional device. And some of them that I'll tell you about, we use today. They're just normal. So let's look at a few of these. Literary spotlighting. Now, we've all been to a theatrical performance at one time or another, and we'll see a bunch of people on the stage, and then the lights go off, and then a spotlight comes on and it shines on a particular individual who breaks out in song or a monologue, right? Well, we know that other actors are on stage, but we can't see them because the focus is on that particular person. Literary spotlighting is when the author knows that there are other people who are involved in the event, but only mentions one, the main person. Let me give you an example of Plutarch doing this. The year is 63 BC. In fact, it's the same year that Pompey went in and took control of Jerusalem. And it's November of that year, and there's a guy named Catiline, Sergius Lucius Catilina, and he was a Roman senator, and he had, for 2 years in a row, he tried to become the most powerful man in Rome. Now, just like we have President of the United States, you have Prime Minister in other countries, in Rome, you had what was called the consul. And there were two of them who served simultaneously. There was a main one, and then there was another one. But he had almost equal authority. So you had two consuls, they served together, they served for 1 year, and then they had an election next year, and two more consuls would come up. Now you could run again for the consulship, but you had to wait 10 years before you could do so. So, what happened in 62 BC was you had Catiline and Cicero run for consul, and Cicero was elected. 62 BC comes up, and Catullus, and a guy named Catullus, and then Catiline, they both ran for consul, and Catullus won, Catiline lost for a second time. So Catiline says, all right, I can't get this by election. He gets a bunch of conspirators to agree with him. They're going to go in, they're going to kill all the Roman senators, they're going to torch the city, and then he and the conspirators are going to build a new Roman government. Well, word of the conspiracy gets out, and someone who goes unnamed writes letters to all the Roman senators, or most of the Roman senators, and to Cicero, who was the lead consul that year. And one night in November of 63 BC, there are three people who go to Cicero's house at night. You like my stick figures? They go to Cicero's house at night and they wake him up, get him out of bed, and they hand him the letters. Well, one of the guys who goes, his name is Crassus. He's the famous Roman general who defeated Spartacus. And he goes with two other guys, and in Plutarch's Life of Cicero, they were called lives then, not biographies. In Plutarch's Life of Cicero, he mentions Crassus, and I think the other two are named Metellus and Marcellus. And they wake Cicero up, and they hand him the letters, and Crassus tells him, there's a conspiracy, we need to give this attention. But when the same story is told in Plutarch's Life of Crassus, he shines a literary spotlight on Crassus, and he only mentions Crassus delivering the letters to Cicero. He doesn't mention Marcellus and Metellus. Why? Because Crassus is his main character. He's the one that matters. The other two don't matter. So he only mentions Crassus. Now, on the following day, Cicero gets up and he calls an emergency meeting of the Senate. And he gets them all together, and he tells them, he delivers the letters to the senators, and he tells them what's going on, and he says, what should we do? Well, Julius Caesar, who was a senator at the time, nowhere near as powerful as he became. Remember, this is 62 BC. He doesn't cross the Rubicon until January 49 BC. And so Caesar gets up and he says, all right, well, Roman law states we got to give the conspirators a trial before we do anything with them. And so what we need to do is confiscate their property in what are called proscriptions, arrest these guys, and put them in prison, and then we'll go after Catiline and his forces. And once we destroy them, then we'll bring these other conspirators up on trial. Well, then Catullus, that's in the life of Caesar and the life of Cicero, And it also reports that Catullus, who had won that year, who would be the consul next year, and a guy named Cato, who is my favorite Roman, Cato the Younger. Both of them get up and they say, no, we've got to crush this conspiracy immediately, and we have to do it with a lot of force and swiftness. So no arrests involved. Let's take the conspirators, but we'll arrest them and immediately execute them, and then go after Catiline. Because if we don't do this, and we just arrest them and put them in prison, the rest of the Romans, who are very uneasy with what's going on in our country at this point, they will join the rebellion, and we have to put this rebellion down. And they are able to convince Cicero and the rest of the Senate for that to happen. And so they arrest the conspirators and immediately put them to death. When the same story is told in Plutarch's Life of Cato, he shines a literary spotlight on Cato. Catullus, even though he's the more important figure at that point, Catullus isn't even mentioned, and it's Cato who, the perception is, single-handedly convinces Cicero and the rest of the Senate to arrest the conspirators and put them to death. But you can see it's a literary spotlight. That Plutarch certainly knows that Catullus was there, but he only mentions Cato because it's the biography of Cato. He's the important one. I could give you several examples of this. In fact, of all the compositional devices that I observed Plutarch using, that's the most frequent one. It's just done all the time. Now, do we see this in the Gospels? Yes. In fact, we see it a lot. We see it a lot even in the resurrection narratives. And we see it with those things that critics often use to say that there are contradictions in the Gospels. Let me give you some examples. How many angels were at the tomb on Easter morning? Matthew and Mark say 1, Luke and John say 2. Isn't it plausible that Matthew and Mark are just using literary spotlighting and just shining their spotlight on the angel who's doing the announcing that Jesus has been raised? You say, well, Mike, that's possible, but how do we know if it's probable? It's certainly possible. It's very plausible too, but do we know that's what they're doing? Well, not for certain, but it's certainly very plausible. Let me give you another example. How many women went to the tomb? Now, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it names multiple women who went to the tomb. When we come to John's Gospel, chapter 20, verse 1, it says, early in the morning while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene got up and ran to the tomb and saw it empty. So, was it just Mary Magdalene? Or were there multiple women? Well, could John be shining a literary spotlight on Mary Magdalene there, knowing that there were other women? But maybe he's doing it because Mary Magdalene was his source? You say, well, that's plausible, Mike. Do we know it for sure? In fact, we can know it for sure. Because the very next verse says Mary Magdalene ran back to Peter and the beloved disciple and said, they have taken the Lord, and we don't know where they laid him. Who's the we? And then, who ran to the tomb when Mary and the women came back and announced it? Well, you've got, in John's Gospel, it says that Peter and the beloved disciple got up and ran to the tomb and found it just as Mary had said. But when you come to Luke's Gospel, it says Peter got up and ran to the tomb and found it as the women had said. Well, was it just Peter? Or were there Peter and the beloved disciple? Well, could Luke be shining his spotlight on Peter because that was his source of this information? Or because Peter was the lead apostle, he puts a spotlight on him? Certainly plausible. Is it probable? In fact, it is. Because when you go 12 verses down in Luke's Gospel, you find that Luke is talking about the story of Jesus appearing to the Emmaus disciples. I mentioned this last night, right? And their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he's talking with them. He says, what happened, guys? Well, they crucified Jesus this past Friday, but this morning some of our women folk went to the tomb, and they said they saw angels who had said that he'd been raised, and the tomb was empty. And then some of our own Some of our own, plural, went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. So, but Luke, 12 verses earlier, you said just Peter. No, Luke would say, I didn't say just Peter, I only mentioned Peter. But that doesn't mean that I only thought that it was only Peter that went to the tomb. I obviously know that there were multiple people who went to the tomb. But Luke, we don't do that in the 21st century when we write biography. Transferal. Transferal is when you take a statement or an action that was performed by one person and you credit it to a different one. And usually this is done to simplify the account. So, here's an example here. It's 62 BC, or 52 BC, so it's 10 years after the Catilinarian conspiracy, and Rome is once again in a period of serious crisis, worse than it was 10 years prior. And there's all kinds of riots that are going on, and it's like, what do we do? And so they go with the drastic option of electing one sole consul for the following year, and that consul would have almost absolute power, which is the very thing that Rome, the Republic, wanted to avoid. That's why they had two consuls, that's why they had a Roman Senate. So what they said was, we will elect one consul. He can get a co-consul if he wants at some point, but for a while we want him to be the sole consul, and he has sole authority to make any laws he wants, but he needs to get this country back in shape. And so they say the only person who's capable of doing it is Pompey, General Pompey, Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great. Now, some say, well, isn't his name pronounced Pompey? No, it's Pompey. Pompeii is the town that was destroyed by the volcano. So the next time someone says, yeah, General Pompey, you say, Pompey. So they elect him as sole consul, and he takes over in 52, and he starts running the country, and he makes some laws to try to get things back in order. And one of the laws that he gives is he says, if someone is on trial, their friends can't come in and give a really good speech in order to build this person up. Say all the good things this person has done, because it's irrelevant to whether he's guilty for the crime he's being charged with, right? So that's the law that he makes. But then, soon after that, Pompey proceeds to break his own law when his friend Plancus is on trial. So Plancus is on trial, and this is Plutarch's Life of Cato, and the way it's reported is Pompey hears about it. Pompey is outside the city with his army at that point, and the rule was when you're outside the city with your army, you cannot come into the city. You have to stay outside until you disperse your troops. So he writes this speech of praise, an encomium it was called, in order to be read at the trial of Plancus. And because he can't come in, he gives it to one of his emissaries and sends it in to be read at the trial. The reason this is reported in Plutarch's Life of Cato is because Cato is a jurist for this trial, and Cato, who is probably one of the most principled men in Rome, stands up and says, this is illegal, and you can't do this, and this was Pompey's own law, and he objects. And right, consul, you would have done that. You would have stood up and objected, said, you can't do that. And then they're pushing it, but Cato stands firm and he objects to it, so much so that he gets kicked out of the jury. So this is why this story is told in Plutarch's Life of Cato. But when Plutarch tells the same story in his Life of Pompey, he says Pompey himself goes into the court and reads it himself, gives the speech himself. After all, it was his own words, so rather than just tell the detail about sending the emissary, he just has Pompey going. Now we read about this story in other ancient literature. We know that Pompey sent an emissary. So Plutarch has simplified the account by transferring the action from his emissary to Pompey himself. Most of us wouldn't have any problem with that. It's just a simplification. Yes, is this what we would have seen had we been there if we read it in the Life of Pompey? No, would have been more like we read in the life of Cato. But it's still communicating an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. And that's what's important. Oh, is it out? Okay. Can you guys hear me all right?
Yes.
All right. So, do we see any of this in the Gospels? The answer is yes. Let me show you some examples. Early in Jesus' ministry, right after the Sermon on the Mount, we see Jesus healing the centurion's servant. So he finishes his Sermon on the Mount, he comes down, he heals a guy, I think a leper, and then he goes toward Capernaum, and a centurion has this sick servant who's about to die. And so Luke's Gospel says this. A centurion has a servant about to die. So what he does is he sends some Jewish leaders, some emissaries to Jesus, and say, look, the centurion is a godly man. He loves our people. In fact, he has helped us build our synagogue. And he's got the servant who is very sick. Please come and heal him for the centurion's sake. And Jesus says, all right, let's go. Well, word gets sent back to the centurion that Jesus is coming. And so the centurion sends some friends out to meet Jesus and saying, wait, the centurion says, I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. But listen, you're a man of authority, I'm a man of authority. I've got soldiers and I say, go, and they go. I tell another, come, and he comes. I tell a servant, do this, and he does it. Since you're a man of authority too, just say the word and my servant will be healed. Jesus praises the centurion for his faith, and he heals his servant from afar without ever seeing the centurion. When we read the same story in Matthew, the centurion himself goes to Jesus and says, I've got a servant, he's sick, please come and heal him. And Jesus says, all right, let's go. And the centurion says, no, I'm unworthy to have you come, but I'm a man of authority, yada, yada, yada. And Jesus praises him for his faith, and he heals him from afar. But in Matthew's version, the centurion himself goes. You can see that Matthew is using transferal just like Plutarch. It's not a contradiction. It is a compositional device because the gospel authors are first century biographers. Therefore, they're going to use the rules for writing biography that were in play in the first century. To think otherwise is to be naive. Here's another example. In Matthew's Gospel, you had James and John, the son of Zebedee, and their mother come to Jesus. And the mother says, I want you to do me a favor. And Jesus says, what can I do for you? And she says, when you come into your kingdom, I want it so that one of my sons sits at your right and the other sits on your left. And so Jesus turns to James and John at that point and says, well, let me ask you guys something. Can you drink the cup with which I'm about to drink? And they look and says, wait. Yeah, we can do that. Can you be baptized with the baptism with which I'm going to be baptized? Yeah, we can do that, no problem. Well, you will drink the cup of which I'm about to drink, and you will be baptized with the baptism with which I'm going to be baptized. But to sit on my right and left, that's for my Father to give. Gee, thanks, Mom. Don't ever do anything for us again. Now, when you read the same story in Mark, we find that Mark brushes old Mom out of the story. Poor old Mom, she's just doing it for her sons. They probably put her up to it, right? They wanted to sit on Jesus' right and left. So why blame Mom? Let's just have it where James and John come up and say, we want you to do us a favor. They cut right to what's behind it. Now, what would we have actually seen had we been there? Well, we would have probably seen the mom asking the favor of Jesus. But Mark gives us an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. He gives us the gist of what occurred. He's using transferal. If we are looking in the Gospels or Plutarch or any ancient history and we are wanting to see a transcript of what was said, we're not going to get that because they were taught that it was proper to paraphrase. If we are looking to see a description a legal prescription of what occurred, we are not going to get that, because that's not what their objective was. But we are going to get, for the good biographers and historians, an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. It's not going to lead us astray. But we can't expect that every detail is as it actually happened. That was not their objective. Let me say this, and this is important. There was one historian of that period who wrote using the biographical or the historical, the literary conventions that we use today. Just the facts. His name was Asconius. Have you ever heard of him? Why do you think that is? Because he did not write according to how they appreciated historical writing of that day. And so a lot of what he wrote has not survived. Compression. Compression is when you narrate a story as though it occurred over a shorter period of time than it actually had. There's some of this going on in the New Testament as well. Let me give you one example. Jesus cursing the fig tree. Now, this gives us a good example of compression. We can see it with the guy versus the girl version of the story, and it's like this. Here's Mark's version. He gives us the girl version of the story. It's in the morning, and the disciples and Jesus are up, and they want to go into Jerusalem, and so they start to walk into Jerusalem. And on the way there from Bethany, which is on the Mount of Olives, they're going to Jerusalem, and Jesus is hungry, and he sees a fig tree. But there's no figs on it, so he curses it. Then he goes into the city, and he goes into the temple, and he cleanses the temple. He overturns the tables in the temple, and then he leaves. And he and his disciples go back to Bethany, and they spend the night in Bethany, up on the Mount of Olives. The next morning, they get up, and they have breakfast. They have fig pancakes that Mary and Martha have made for them. And Peter pours on Mrs. Butterworth syrup, and Jesus says, "Do you have Mrs. Butterworth light syrup?" Peter says, "I'll have some coffee." And Jesus says, "I'd like some coffee too. Decaf, please." And then Peter says, "Hey, throw the bacon and eggs on there." Oh, that's right. Wait a minute. They're Jews. They don't have bacon. So they have breakfast. They finish breakfast. And then afterward, they head back into Jerusalem. And as they come near the city, Peter sees the fig tree that Jesus had cursed on the previous day and says, "Lord, the tree that you had cursed, it has withered and died." That's Mark. Matthew gives us the guy version. They get up, go to Jerusalem, he curses the tree, and it dies. That's it. In fact, the temple cleansing occurred on the previous day in Matthew. But he has to do that because he's compressing the story to make it, I guess, maybe just to simplify or to increase the drama, whatever reason, he compresses the story, and that's what we got. Now, I can imagine Mark reading Matthew, and he gets with him, they're having dinner, and says, "Now, Matty, come on, you know it didn't happen that way." And Matthew said, "Back off, Mark. You remind me of my wife." Matthew is doing compression, and it happens throughout the ancient literature. We see it going on in the Gospels. They're not trying to distort truth. They are giving us, this is how truth was told in ancient biography, and we need not look at this as though they are corrupting the text. Not only does Plutarch, the greatest of all ancient biographers, do it, Suetonius does it, who is the greatest of the Roman biographers, and then you've got Tacitus, the greatest Roman historian, does it, and you've got Sallust, who is another great historian. I mentioned him last night. So good was Sallust that Quintilian said that Sallust was a better historian than Livy, and that one must be well advanced in their studies in order to appreciate him properly. I think we can say something similar as we look at these things. One must understand how ancient history and biography was written in order to appreciate why we've got differences in the Gospels. I think we've been asking the wrong question when it comes to Gospel differences. The question we've been asking is, how can we reconcile, how can we harmonize the differences? When the question we should have been asking is, why are the differences here to begin with? And when we look at it through the lens of ancient biography, a lot makes more sense. So when we read the Gospels, as a first century biographers writing to first century readers about a first century figure, they're going to use literary rules that were in play in the first century. And when they do this, we're going to see that a whole lot more in the Gospels come into focus with these differences. But I'll add this in closing. There is more that we can get out of this, because if an approach, if a paradigm is correct, then on many occasions it's going to shed light in other areas. And we find this with the Gospels. You see, for many years, critics have been saying, skeptics have been saying, that the view of, we find evolution going on in the Gospels. So for example, the view of Jesus, which is called Christology, the study of who Jesus thought he was, who the earliest Christians thought he was, we see that this evolving from one gospel to another. So the first gospel to be written, probably Mark, has Jesus as the Son of Man. So there's a lot of humanity there. And then in the next gospel, you got Matthew emphasizing that Jesus is Messiah. And then in Luke's gospel, you have Jesus presented as the Son of God. And then finally, in John's gospel, you have Jesus as God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So you see this, as Shabir Ali, the best Muslim debater in the world, said in a debate, he said, you see a snowballing effect as Jesus rolls from one gospel to the next. That's a nice rhetorical effect, isn't it? Even though it's wrong. So, do we see this evolution going on? Well, what about when we read the Gospels as ancient biography? This is where it gets interesting. So, the most quoted passage in Plutarch's Lives is chapter 1 of his Life of Alexander the Great. And in that chapter he says, look, don't get disappointed as you read this biography of Alexander if I don't mention some other events, major events of which you are aware. Because he says, this is a life, a biography, not a history. What he means by that is, and he continues, he says, in a portrait, the painter is going to focus on the face, and especially the eyes, in order to communicate the character of his person. He wants to encapsulate that and communicate that through the eyes. He says, so do I want to, in my portraits of these figures, these literary portraits, I want to communicate the character, who this person is, through their actions and their words. So and he says this in a few other biographies as well, his Life of Cato, and there's a couple of others. So he's basically saying, the stories that I'm going to tell about Alexander and some of the others, my objective in selecting these particular stories is to illuminate who Alexander was. That's the objective behind ancient biography. Now, instead of just looking at the Gospels as literature written about Jesus, let's look at them as the genre in which they are, ancient biographies, and see, well, what do the stories that Mark is reporting about Jesus, what does that tell us about Jesus? What do they tell us about Jesus? How does Mark's Gospel start? As Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. It actually says in the Septuagint, make straight the paths of our God. And even in the Hebrew, it's referring to God. And then he goes on, right after that, to narrate John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. Not Jesus preparing the way for God. So what does that say from the very beginning about who Mark is going to be saying Jesus is? It's God. That's chapter 1. That's how it begins. Chapter 2, Jesus heals a paralytic and forgives him his sins. And so then you've got the Jewish leaders there saying, well, that's blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins. Yep, Chapter 3, Jesus is rebuked by the Jewish leaders for casting out demons and says, he's Satan casting out Satan. And Jesus gives an illustration. He says, well, look, if there's a strong man and he owns a house and you want to go in and rob him, in order to do that, you must first bind the strong man, and then you can take all his goods. And what he is saying through that illustration is he's saying Satan is the strong man, and what Jesus is doing by his exorcisms, it shows that he has bound Satan and is now plundering his kingdom of souls. What human can bind Satan? Even in the letter of Jude, it says the archangel, the top angel Michael, even refused to rebuke Satan and saying, the Lord rebuke you. But here's Jesus saying, I have bound Satan and I'm plundering his kingdom. Chapter 4, Jesus has just healed Legion, and now he crosses the Sea of Galilee, and a storm comes up, and they wake him up, and he calms the wind and the waves. Something that the Old Testament says only God calms the wind. Chapter 5, Jesus raises the dead, which the Old Testament says only God does. Now, granted, there were some apostles, there were some prophets who raised the dead, and they were never believed to be God, but they appealed to God and asked God to do it. Jesus did not do that. He raised the dead by his own word and power. Chapter 6, Jesus walks on water, something Job says only God does. And then you go on and on and on throughout the Gospel of Mark. What is Mark saying about Jesus through this? In fact, it culminates, one of the high points is Mark chapter 14, verses 61 through 63, where he's before the high priest. And the high priest says, all right, just tell us clearly, are you the Messiah, the Son of God? And Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, said, yes, I am. And I'm the Messiah, the Son of God, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Seated at the right hand, he's going to be a co-occupant of God's throne, and he's going to ride the clouds of heaven, something the Old Testament says God does. And now we can understand why the high priest tears his clothes and says that's blasphemy, he's worthy of death. Because Jesus, in his confession there, was saying that he is the uniquely divine Son of God, equal to God, sitting on the throne with him. That's blasphemy if it's not true. So Jesus, Mark is giving us the deeds of Jesus and words of Jesus to tell us who he is in his biography of Jesus. He is God's uniquely divine Son. And so to read the Gospels as ancient biographies, through that lens, even Christology comes a lot more into focus. So, I'm going to end there, and just truth-telling in ancient biography, we talked about that. There are compositional devices in the compositional textbooks and in Plutarch. You get some more information, videos, articles at our website, risenjesus.com. And do we have time for questions?
Let's take one or two. Yep, there and three. Go, short answers.
Oftentimes, skeptics will conflate scientific evidence with historical evidence when interacting with the Gospel and the New Testament. What's a good framework when engaging with historical evidence to kind of keep the conversation grounded in truth? Like, oftentimes someone will say, well, how can you know that Lazarus raised from the dead even though you have the accounts? What's a good framework to understand, at least for people leaving this conference, to engage in those conversations?
Okay, so I guess for the purpose, I'll repeat it for the purpose of the video. So I understand you were saying that the challenge will say, okay, science would show people can't be raised from the dead, so why should we believe, say, the story of Lazarus? Okay, I'd say, well, it comes from an eyewitness who was there, John, the beloved disciple. But we can't really prove it. That's the only account of it we have. If it were in two independent accounts, like if Mark had reported, because most scholars think that Matthew and Luke use Mark as a primary source. So if it's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, then they just say it's one source, Mark. But if it's in Mark and John, they think John was independent of Mark, so because there's very little in common between the two. But if it were two, then we would have a stronger argument for historicity. It's not to say that it didn't happen, it's just to say we can't prove it. So there's many things in the Bible, in the Gospels, that we can't prove. We can't prove Jesus' virgin birth and a number of things. We just don't have enough evidence for it. So what I would just say to someone who's challenged about Lazarus, I would say, you know, as a historian, I cannot prove Jesus raised Lazarus. But as a historian, I do think I can prove Jesus was raised from the dead. And that's a little more important, because if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true, even if it were to be the case that the story of Lazarus was not.
Okay, Clay?
Yeah, so how did you discover that it was inappropriate or improper to quote somebody verbatim, and does that have hermeneutical?
Well, yeah, all right, so how did I discover that it was improper to quote someone verbatim, and does this have hermeneutical implications? I discovered it because it's in the compositional textbooks. Don't, you know, it doesn't come out and say don't quote someone verbatim, but it shows you how to paraphrase them, and you're doing all these kinds of exercises to learn how to do it. Then, when I read ancient historians and biographers and they're quoting someone, you read how the same author will quote the same person, but differently. They're saying different things. Now, the gist is still there, but the words that they use are different. So we can see that they are applying what they had learned in the compositional textbooks in the actual end product, their biographies and histories that they're writing. What does this mean for hermeneutical implications? You know, I don't know. We could wrestle with that, but I believe the Bible is divinely inspired. I can't prove that, all right, but I believe that it is. And so if I'm, say, a pastor, or I'm a student of the Bible, which I am, not a pastor, but I'm a student of the Bible, and I'm reading the words of Jesus, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, these guys probably are not reporting, for the most part, the exact words of Jesus. In fact, when you compare them from gospel to gospel, you can see that they do differ. So they are not reporting the exact words of Jesus. Or you say, well, which one gives us the exact words of Jesus, right? But in fact, when you compare how the gospel authors use the same words, they stick a lot closer, actually. When you read the words of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're a lot closer to one another than what Plutarch is when he quotes the same person in another writing. So they seem to respect Mark and want to stay closer to the words of Jesus than what Plutarch did with his sources, what Tacitus and Sallust did with his sources. So we like that for today, okay? But I would say if we do think that the Bible is divinely inspired, then God used these processes to accomplish what he wanted with these words. And something we do have to remember is, again, our view of Scripture must be consistent with what we observe in Scripture. And the second principle I give my students is that we must embrace Scripture. If we truly have a high view of Scripture, if we want to have a high view of Scripture, then we must embrace Scripture as God has given it to us, rather than being committed to a model of it of how we think he should have. And if we refuse to do this, we may believe we have a high view of Scripture, but in reality, we have a high view of our view of Scripture.
You said you're writing further on this
Yes.
in the upcoming book. Yeah. So we look forward to that chapter, right here in the message.
I guess I understand that Mark is the most accurate.
No, I wouldn't say it's the most accurate.
Well, I guess that was my point. Well, anyway, my question was going to be that if Mark is the most accurate, why wouldn't you just chuck the rest of it and say it was all embellishment?
Well, so if we were to say Mark is the most accurate, because I guess you would say because maybe he was the first, and because Matthew and Luke use him and sometimes edit what he says, then why wouldn't we just chuck the others? If we do think that the Bible is divinely inspired, then we can get things through the others as well. Sometimes Mark is a little unclear on things that Matthew and Luke and John will clarify. And if Matthew preserves eyewitness testimony from Matthew as well, Matthew was there, if John does as well, if Luke's getting his information from eyewitnesses and those who knew the eyewitnesses, then they can provide some clarity on some things that Mark is unclear. Now, I'm not saying Mark is not the most, I don't think there is a most accurate. They all come from different different perspectives, but they say things differently using these compositional devices. And sometimes we find things like Matthew and Luke will improve Mark's grammar because Mark's grammar is awkward at times. So, yeah.
Listen, we're gonna have to do this.
Oh, come on, just give him more.
Well, you meet him at the book table.
Yeah, we really, I'm directive, remember? Okay, my literary. Remember my policy? If you raise money for it, you get to do what you want to do. All right, first of all, on Audible, Mike's going to pack up and he's going to go to the book table, and so you can meet him there. For the workshops that's starting, let's do those in 10 minutes from now, so go 11:40 to 12:40. Also, we'll continue this conversation for those of you who can join us for the brown bag.